thank you guys for joining, and thank you, Dr. Omisade, for agreeing to help us out with this wonderful chat on memory and enlightening us. Look forward to hearing your presentation.
My pleasure. So if you're ready for me to start sharing the screen. Okay. Oh, here we go. This should work.
Okay.
Okay, do you see my screen now?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. Technology is awesome. Okay. All right. So thanks everyone for joining in. Thank you, Cassidy, for inviting me today to talk about memory, particularly memory in relation to epilepsy. This is something that I deal with and work with, regularly as part of my kind of regular job. So I'm a clinical neuropsychologist with the epilepsy program. And looking at cognition and cognitive functions is something that that's a main part of my job. So I work with the epilepsy program here at the QE2 Health Sciences Center in Halifax. So before we kind of get into the epilepsy specific issues, I'll talk a little bit about, what does it mean to learn and remember things, and how does memory work in the brain? And that will give us a good perspective on why memory problems are so common and how we can best work to compensate or overcome them as part of epilepsy. So I'm just going to go through some typical memory complaints that I hear from my patients. And I'd like you guys to just sort of think about if any of these sound familiar to you. So my wife says I don't listen to anything she tells me. She says that it seems to go into one ear and come out the other. I go to the store and forget what I was supposed to get. I walk into a room and forget why I went there. I have trouble with reading. When I read a page, the words just don't sink in. I forget appointments when I have to be somewhere or go somewhere. I forget names of friends, even the ones I've known for years. There's a word I want to say and I just can't think of it, and half an hour later it comes to me. And finally, what a lot of people say is my long-term memory for things that happened 20 years ago is okay, but I can't remember what happened yesterday. So a lot of the complaints that I tend to hear are ones that what we refer to as short-term memory, which tends to be the biggest part of memory that's impaired in most neurological situations. So just to give you an idea of how, as neuropsychologists, we conceptualize the structure of memory. So it can be, memory begins with short-term memory. And from a neuropsychological standpoint, from a medical standpoint, we consider short-term memory to be of limited capacity. This is something that most people would think of as attention span. So basically, it's something that you can keep in your mind for a few minutes at a time, and usually it's very limited in how much you can store at the same time. So it's, for example, being able to remember a grocery list or a phone number for a few minutes. You can keep it for a little bit, but then it's going to start fading or become forgotten if you don't repeat it constantly or if you don't write it down. So that's short-term memory. So some of those short-term memories will get transformed into long-term memories. So these are the memories that you can retain for a long period of time, for hours or years. So long-term memory is generally considered to be unlimited in its capacity, and it's thought to be permanent. Long-term memory can be further subdivided into declarative memory and non-declarative or implicit memory. So declarative memory is what we think about the most often when we think about memory. So these are the things that you can consciously recall and describe. So for example, you can talk about what you did yesterday, what you had for dinner. You can describe your last vacation. So those are explicit and conscious memories. Whereas non-declarative or implicit memories are things like knowing how to tie your shoelaces or ride a bike. So these are not the things that you would normally, try to kind of explain or think about. You just kind of do them. So in terms of declarative memories, there's a further subdivision that's important. So one type of declarative memories is episodic or autobiographical memories. So these are very personally relevant and contextual memories. So these are the things that are associated with a specific time period that you can identify. So this would be things like your wedding, when your children were born, or when you started school for the first time. So these are kind of very personal autobiographical episodes that are linked to a specific time period. Semantic memory is based on episodic memory, and it just describes your general knowledge of the world. So it's not knowledge that has any particular context. It's just something that you know, like facts about the world. For example, that the world is round and that the capital of Canada is Ottawa, those sorts of things. So non-declarative memory, I won't go into too much. It essentially involves memory for things like procedures. Like I said, things that you can just, know how to do, like tying your shoelaces or riding a bike. It involves things like habituation, so basically forming habits through repeated actions, or priming, which is essentially being able to remember something easier when you're exposed to something similar just beforehand. So for example, if I were to say the word doctor, you should be able to think of the word nurse really quickly. So that's an example of priming. So in vast majority of neurological conditions and vast majority of complaints that we see clinically tend to be associated with declarative episodic memories, right? So the other kinds of memories can fade and can be affected in some cases, but usually it's in very severe forms of dementia. So most people with epilepsy, when we talk about memory problems, we're talking about mostly declarative, episodic, or autobiographical memories. So these will be the focus of the rest of the presentation. So now that we've talked about sort of the cognitive structure of memory, let's talk about the process by which we actually remember information. So how do memory go from short-term into long-term? So first we start with attention. Attention is the basis of everything. So we're exposed at any given time to a great variety and a great number of information and input. Okay, so when we have so much in the world that we have to pay attention to, we're obviously not going to remember everything. So attention enables us to filter out things that are important and not so much pay attention to things that are not important. So attention determines what we will eventually learn and remember. Then once you have filtered it out, you have to learn this information. And learning is basically filing information among your existing memories. So how do you take something new and then put it into your mind along with other things that are similar where it belongs? So in these situations, what can help learning is asking yourself, how does it relate to what I know? Does it make sense? And is it meaningful to me? So these things can really help with memory, with learning. Finally, after you learn the information, there's the storage piece, which is a bit more passive. So storage is essentially just being able to keep the information safe in your mind and your brain in its proper place until you need it again. And then, of course, remembering is retrieving the information when it's needed. And this depends on the previous stages. So was the information filed properly? Did it go in the right place in your brain? And is it still there when you need to access it? So problems with memory can arise at any one of these stages, and we'll talk a little bit about them and how they're affected in epilepsy in particular. So just to give you kind of a more of a visual example of what I'm talking about, well-organized or good memory is like a library. So you have a well-organized library where, when you get a new book, you know exactly which section it's going to go to. It's properly numbered. It's put in among other books that are similar, so that when you go in and have to find it, you know exactly where to go and where to get it. Now, when you have memory problems, your memory storage, it looks something like this, right? So all the information might be there, but you have no idea where to look for it. You don't even know if it's there anymore, right? So this is what happens when you start having memory problems. Your mental library becomes more and more disorganized, which makes it much more difficult to keep information safe and then retrieve it when you need it. Okay, so in terms of how it actually maps onto the brain, so all of these things that we've talked about, the areas that are particularly important to the memory processing in the brain are the frontal lobe, right, which is the very, the first 1/3 of your brain, and then the temporal lobe. In the temporal lobe, the areas that are of particular interest, both with respect to memory and with respect to epilepsy actually, are the amygdala and hippocampus, so these internal structures in the very kind of deep in the middle of the brain, and the parahippocampal gyrus, which is just this little structure that's underlying the hippocampus. So these are the areas that are critical to normal memory formation, storage, and remembering. So when we think about how the processes that we just talked about map onto those areas, this is roughly how it would go. So encoding or learning, as we talked about, short-term retention relies on mainly the frontal lobe and the thalamus. So this is where the initial kind of learning process and short-term storage happens. Then when you're ready to transfer information from the short-term memory to long-term memory, this is where the amygdala, hippocampus, and the parahippocampal gyrus are critical. So you can think of these areas as sort of the librarian of the brain. So this is where the information is going to go to be labeled and coded to be sent for long-term storage elsewhere. And then retrieval is the ability to extract information from memory, and this involves both the frontal and the temporal lobe, depending on the kinds of memories we're talking about. So you can sort of see how the process of information turning into memory is mapped onto specific areas of the brain. And for those of you who have epilepsy, you will recognize these areas of the brain as being some of the most commonly affected as part of epilepsy. So the other thing to consider is what side of the brain might be affected, right? So most of the time, in many cases of epilepsy, especially focal epilepsy, the lesion or the area where the seizures are coming from is either on the right side of the brain or the left side of the brain. So depending on which side is affected, you can have more effects either in nonverbal memory or verbal memory. So nonverbal memory affects things like faces, places, music, abstract shapes and patterns, things that you can't really verbalize and can't put into words and describe. So it's things that you see. Whereas verbal memory relates more to things that you hear and things that you read, like stories, conversations, music, lyrics, that sort of thing. So depending on which side of the brain is more affected, you will notice more difference in one type of these memories versus the other. So just to give you an example, I'm gonna show you a set of pictures, and I want you to try and remember them without writing anything down, without drawing them, and without verbalizing them. And we're gonna test you for that memory a little bit later on. So I'll give you about 10 seconds to have a look at the picture. Okay. So I hope you all remember that. And I'm going to show you a list that's a list from a menu, a list of menu items. And I want you to try and remember them the best you can within the 10 seconds without writing anything down. Okay. So we'll look at these a little bit later in the presentation to see how many you've remembered and what strategies you found the most useful. So talking specifically about epilepsy and memory. So now we understand how we conceptualize or how we think about memory from the neuropsychological and from the medical perspective, how it's represented in the brain, what are the stages that transform information into long-term memories that we can then use as needed. So let's talk a little bit about how memory plays out and is affected in epilepsy specifically. So I think most of you won't really need this, but just to kind of give a very brief introduction to epilepsy for folks who might not be as familiar. So as you're aware, epilepsy is a disorder of the brain that's characterized by recurring and unprovoked seizures. A seizure is a sudden and abnormal burst of electrical activity in the gray matter of the brain, and having one seizure does not mean that you have epilepsy. So it requires either multiple seizures over a course of time, or it requires a permanent change in the brain that would result in recurring seizures. So this is what I just said. So, and these long-term or permanent changes can come from a variety of areas. It can be developmental abnormalities. It can be from a stroke, a traumatic brain injury, a tumor, a neurodegenerative disorder like Alzheimer's disease or something like that. And seizures can also manifest, or they can show themselves in a variety of ways depending on which parts of the brain are involved. So everybody's seizures look and feel a little bit different. So because seizures affect different parts of the brain and can come from many different causes, the cognitive impact of epilepsy can also be very, very different. So these are all the different areas of thinking skills that can be impacted in epilepsy, but memory is one of the main areas that tends to be affected and that people complain about the most often. So it's very, very common in terms of cognitive issues that the people with epilepsy describe. So why? Why is memory so commonly affected? Well, memory can be impacted by a variety of different factors. So one of the things that can really affect memory is stress, anxiety, and low mood. So when you're stressed, when you're anxious, when you're depressed, your brain is not efficient at forming new memories. You're not as good at paying attention. You're not as efficient in categorizing your memories, and you're not as good at looking for them when you need them. So all of these things can really impact the effectiveness of your learning. Medication. So medication for a variety of neurological disorders, but especially for epilepsy, they tend to subdue the activity of the brain. So they tend to kind of make the brain a little bit slower, right? So that impacts how well you're able to pay attention and filter out things that are not important, and also affects how quickly you're able to remember new material. And when you're in the world where things are coming at you really fast, it can affect how well you're able to learn new information. So if you're not able to pay attention, if you're not able to learn it, you're not going to have it later on when you need it. There's also direct effects of brain damage in memory areas. So as we talked about, the temporal lobe is particularly vulnerable to epilepsy, and sometimes people can have either tumors or developmental problems or other lesions in those areas that directly impact memory. And because those parts of the brain are damaged, memories are not going to be formed very effectively. There's also a direct effect of seizures in memory areas. So regardless of where the seizures are coming from, if the abnormal electrical activity affects the parts of the brain that are important for memory, once again, memories are not going to be stored efficiently. And finally, for the individuals who undergo epilepsy surgery, especially in the temporal lobe, that will usually have some sort of an impact on memory because it's just basically creating a planned lesion or damage in the brain. So when we talk about epilepsy in particular, these three areas are the ones that are most kind of unique and specific to epilepsy, and are among the main reasons why people with epilepsy tend to have concerns about their memory. So when we think about epilepsy, this is just kind of a visual demonstration of sort of what happens. So if you have frontal lobe epilepsy or frontal problems, you tend to have issues with attention, learning, and free recall. And then if you have temporal lobe issues, you have problems with storage and retention. So just to give you more detailed examples of that, so for people with temporal lobe epilepsy or epilepsy that affects the temporal lobes, individuals with those kinds of problems are typically able to pay attention and learn as fast as anybody else. And they can remember information well for a few minutes. But if there's a delay, half an hour to an hour or more, they can no longer remember that information, and cues or reminders are not helpful. And this is because the temporal lobes are involved in storage and retention. So the information is attended to, it's learned, and it's retained for a short period of time, but it's not stored anywhere. It's kind of lost in that messy library that I showed you. So even reminders are not going to be very helpful in bringing that information back out when it's needed. Now, in situations where frontal lobe is affected by epilepsy, which is the second most common area most frequently impacted in this disorder, individuals need lots of repetition. They have a greater difficulty paying attention and learning. They need extra time to get the information in. Learning is better when the information is well organized and meaningful, right? So it takes a while to get that information in, but once it's in, it stays there. Okay, so even if somebody is having trouble recalling it without help, when you give them a reminder or a cue, the information comes back out because it's still there and it's still something that you're able to locate. In terms of surgery, individuals who have surgery in the right or the non-language dominant side of the brain tend to have issues with face memory, forgetting directions, recognition of places, and thinking back to the examples that I gave just a little while ago, you would have trouble remembering the symbols that I showed you. The interesting thing about it is that a lot of people tend not to notice a big change in their nonverbal memory after surgery. And I think the reason being is that for the most part, when we live our lives, in day-to-day, how we go about our lives in the day-to-day world, we rely on our verbal memory a lot more. So there's a lot of things that we can sort of verbalize and write down and think about verbally. So we don't really rely on pure nonverbal memory too much. Now, people who have surgery in the left or the language dominant hemisphere tend to find that they're having greater difficulties with short-term memory for conversations, things like grocery lists, some life events or details, and academic work. So for individuals who are in school, they will have trouble retaining what they're reading and remembering things for exams. And thinking back to the examples that I gave you, the menu items would be affected by that. So this is the kind of change after surgery that tends to really have an impact on somebody's life. So a few things to remember about memory problems in epilepsy. If you do have them, they're very rarely progressive. So for the most part, we do not expect that people who have memory problems as a result of their seizures will progress to have dementia or Alzheimer's disease or anything like that. Now, that being said, it does depend on why you have epilepsy in the first place. Because if you have epilepsy because you have a brain condition that predisposes you to having Alzheimer's or having another kind of dementia, of course, you're much more likely to get it, but it's not because of epilepsy per se. It's because of the actual brain trauma that's causing the seizures. But by and large, if you have memory problems in epilepsy, you're not at any much greater risk for dementia. Now, the other thing to remember is that memory functioning may improve with good seizure control or depending on specific medications. So some medications we know have a very negative impact on memory. So one of the big culprits for this, for example, is topiramate. So topiramate can be very effective in a lot of people in controlling their seizures, but it also has very significant cognitive side effects on things like memory, speech, speed of processing, and those kinds of things. But by and large, people who achieve good seizure control, either with surgery or with medication or a combination of the two, tend to report either an improvement in their memory or at least a slowed decline in their memory abilities. If you have had surgery, you will probably notice the greatest memory loss right after surgery, and it does tend to improve over time. So the biggest improvement usually occurs during the time when the brain heals the quickest, which is usually within the first 6 months to a year. And then after that, you can notice additional improvements over the course of another year or two, which is based on learning adaptive strategies that we'll talk about in a minute. And in some cases, surgery can improve overall memory functioning if seizure control is achieved. And one of the things to remember is that memory issues, by and large, are not unique to epilepsy. So if you are having memory difficulties, it's not necessarily because you have seizures, but because, you know, everybody has some issues with memory. So in terms of recovery, what can we do? So when we think about memory loss, first of all, it's very important to understand what is normal and what is not normal. So first thing to remember is that everybody forgets, okay? Every single person that's ever lived has forgotten something, usually at least once a day. So in most people, memory complaints are just a normal process that are not associated with anything abnormal. It's just part of how our brain works. We can't possibly remember everything. So when do you start to worry? So there are certain circumstances when you might think that memory problems are abnormal or worse than they should be. First of all, if you have to give up something that you did at work or at home because you can't remember things anymore. So if you can no longer work because you don't remember where you put things at work, or you don't remember what you have to do or how to do it, that's a problem. If you can no longer read when you used to read a lot, and you can't remember a plot of a book, or you can't watch movies because you don't remember a plot of a movie when you used to be able to do that, that can be a problem. Relying too much on notes or other reminders. Everybody relies on notes and everybody has reminders, but when you have to rely on notes and reminders for every single thing you have to remember every day, that can indicate that maybe the problem is worse than it should be normally. Frequently making serious mistakes because of memory problems. So by serious mistakes, I mean, like, I don't mean necessarily forgetting to buy milk when you go to the grocery store. By this, I mean forgetting to pick up your kid from daycare. I mean, that's a serious mistake, right? So if you're, missing a child on your way home, then, you should be considering that a serious memory problem. Frequently forgetting events or conversations, even with detailed reminders. So let's say, for example, you go on vacation and you can't remember anything about the vacation or what happened, and people show you pictures and people tell you what happened and you still can't remember. That's an indicator of a serious memory problem. If you forget to take your medication several times a month, that could be an indicator of an issue. And when people close to you notice big changes or problems, but you don't. So if somebody very close to you that you trust is saying that your memory is getting worse, but you're not necessarily noticing anything, it's worthwhile taking it seriously and getting it checked out. So when you've identified memory difficulties, what can you actually do? So this is where we go back to sort of targeting the different parts of the memory process that we talked about. So one thing is to help enhance your attention. So one of the things I always tell people is do one thing at a time. Multitasking is not your friend when you have memory difficulties. You have to make sure that one of the things that you're doing, the task that you're focusing on right now, has a chance to get transferred from the short-term to the long-term memory. And when you do many things at once, it just doesn't happen very effectively. When you're having a conversation with someone, make sure to keep eye contact. Around the house, reduce clutter to make things easier to find. Eliminate noise when you're reading or doing other important activities. Repeat information multiple times. And when possible, whenever possible, encode it in multiple different ways. So for example, you can see something, you can hear it. So if you're reading a book, you can also listen to an audiobook, and you can do something like write it down. So if you do it multiple different ways, you're much more likely to pay attention and remember it. Being organized is very important. So organization helps with learning. So creating a routine makes it easier to remember daily tasks. Always put things in the same place. You can pair your activities. And this is something that I always recommend for medications, because by and large, we always take our medications around the same time every day. So you can pair your medication with something like getting up in the morning or brushing your teeth or having breakfast. It's something that you always do at a roughly the same time every day, so that one activity triggers the other one. So it's kind of like that priming that we talked about in a little bit earlier. You can categorize information and break it down into chunks. So this is most effective for remembering tasks or lists of things. So when you have a list of, let's say, the grocery list, you can organize things into vegetables, fruits, meat, and dairy, right? And within each category, you can have 5 or 6 different items, but it's going to help you to remember those different categories because you're only remembering 4 categories and not 18 or 24 items. You can create rhymes and stories to remember information like names or words or other things that don't seem related. And you can couple words with images. So when you hear a name, you can visualize a person at the same time. Or when you're thinking about a grocery list, you can envision every single item on your grocery list. So kind of create a visual image plus a verbal cue. When you're trying to remember information, reminders are obviously very helpful. So using timers and alarms, you can retrace your steps if you've lost something. Writing things down, so keeping your notes in one place. And this is really important. So a lot of people tell me that they have notes and post-it notes all over their house, and that's not going to work, okay? The only way reminders and notes are going to work is if you are consistent in keeping them, and you keep them all in a place that's easily accessible and preferably one place. And fortunately, these days, we all have, either smartphones or something very similar to that. So you have this perfect device that's on you at all times that you can use to keep all of your notes that are not going to get lost. So on the similar note, memory aids, so these reminders and notes should be consistently and easily accessible. So if you have a notebook that you keep by your bed and you're out at a restaurant or you're out in school and you don't have it, it's not a very effective memory aid. So you really have to keep something with you at all times. You have to make it a habit to use and check memory aids. A phone and a notebook are not going to be helpful if you don't use it and if you don't check it. So make it a habit to do so. And this is really important. When you have an alarm or an alert that tells you to do something, you have to do it immediately. Because what sometimes happens is you have an alarm that reminds you to take your medication. The alarm goes off, you turn it off, you get distracted, and you forget all about it, right? So before you go and do something else, do the thing that your reminder is telling you to do, and then move on to other activities. The other thing that's important in memory is managing your stress. So when you forget something, oftentimes it's associated with things like anxiety and panic, anger, sadness, disappointment, and frustration. When you forget or make a mistake, don't panic. Again, it happens to everybody. Stop and take a breath. Do something else for a few minutes. Sometimes getting distracted and not thinking about something obsessively helps you remember. Talk to yourself. Remind yourself that everyone forgets something. So it's not necessarily an abnormal situation. During the day, give your brain a rest. It's really, really important to take rest breaks. You can't go for 12 hours of the day. So if you're the kind of person who is busy from the moment you get up to the moment you go to bed, make sure to have a few good rest breaks in your day when you're just not really mentally or physically engaged in anything. And learn to say no. So again, a lot of us tend to get overwhelmed under the demands that we have on us, on our time every single day. And when we are too overwhelmed, it becomes really difficult to remember everything that we need to remember. So just kind of learn to pick and choose the things that are a priority for you versus things that don't really need to be done. So before we get to the end, let's see what you can remember. Okay, so take a few minutes and think about which of the images you saw before and write down the numbers for yourself. Okay, and let's see how you did. Okay. So if you got none of them right, that's fine. If you got most of them right, think about the kinds of strategies that were that might have potentially been helpful for you, and we can discuss them and talk about them in the question period. So for verbal memory, so right now what I would like you to do is write down all of the items that you remember from that list that I showed you before. Okay, so this is the list. So think about and check off how many you've remembered, and think about what strategies were helpful. And one of the strategies that would be particularly helpful in remembering something like this is the chunking that I talked about. So you can separate the list into 5 different categories. So instead of remembering a list of however many items are here, you can remember only 5 different categories that have those items in them. Okay, so I think this is pretty much everything that I had prepared to say. Just before we finish, I just want to acknowledge the Nova Scotia Health Authority Epilepsy Program. So these are all the wonderful people who work with me here at the QE2, who help out people with epilepsy here in Halifax. So none of the work that I do would be possible without them. And I just wanted to kind of acknowledge everyone who is part of this wonderful program. And thanks very much. So I'm going to stop sharing right now, and then whenever Cassidy is ready, we can move on to questions.
Awesome. Can you switch the host to me for?
I'll try.
Yeah.
Okay.
As you're doing that, I just want to say thank you. That was very good and very informative. Yeah. So as soon as switched over, we can. Awesome. So if you guys have any questions, like I said at the beginning, feel free to put them in the chat, or there's a little like a raise hand button under participants somewhere, I believe. Oh, reactions. You can raise the hand, and I can unmute you. Yeah. All right. So Lori says it was a fabulous presentation. Thank you for doing it.
Oh, happy to do it.
I want to keep that open.
Thank you, sir.
Just, yeah. Anyone have any questions? Any comments?
Have
Is that great?
Have you done any psychology tests on people who've had a deep brain stimulator implanted?
Yes.
Since I had it implanted, the first month when it wasn't activated, I didn't notice a big difference, but it was turned on 6 weeks ago, and once it was turned on, my memory has taken a severe change to the worse.
Mm-hmm.
I'm forgetting things within 5 minutes of being told something or reading something.
Right. So which do you know which part of your brain the stimulator is affecting? Because they can put it into different parts of the brain. Do you know where your stimulator went?
The right temporal lobe.
The right temporal lobe. Was it directly in the temporal lobe, or was it somewhere else?
Temporal lobe.
Temporal lobe. Okay, well, so if your stimulator went into the temporal lobe, this is an example. It's almost like the impact of surgery, right? So it would make sense that if something's been inserted into the temporal lobe and it's emitting electrical pulses, or it's doing something to that temporal lobe, it would affect how well you're able to store new information. So it makes sense that you would have greater difficulties transferring memories into long-term memory. So you'd forget them after 5 minutes and then they won't come back, right? So if you are concerned about that, you can certainly try some of the strategies that we've talked about. Or you can request another neuropsychological assessment to have a look at how things have changed, so that we can give you more customized or personal recommendations to kind of target your specific difficulties. Has there been anything that has helped you with your memory so far? Anything that you have tried?
Not for the past 6 weeks, because also for some reason after the deep brain stimulator was activated, I've been real tired all the time as well for some reason. I don't know.
Yeah, that can certainly have an impact on memory as well. So being tired makes you a lot less efficient in how well you learn. So it's probably a combination of things. It's a combination of, fatigue that's affecting your attention and your speed of thinking, and then the actual effects that the stimulator is potentially having on the temporal lobe, which is important for information storage. So out of the strategies that we talked about in this presentation, have you tried any of those in the last 6 weeks?
Well, I've been playing games on Facebook that are where you have to try and remember things.
Right.
That's pretty much the only thing I can think of. And playing word games, trying to.
So this actually brings me to a really good point. Is a lot of these kind of games that target memory and that are supposed to enhance your thinking skills. So the research that we have on these kinds of games is that they actually have very limited benefit in improving your memory or your thinking in your day-to-day life. So what those games do is that they make you better at playing those games, right? So you will get better at the games that you play, but in your day-to-day life, it's not really going to translate into any significant change in your ability to remember the things that you have to do, or the things that you're reading or watching on TV, or the conversations you're having. So the games are good and they're fine. They're certainly not harmful, but in and of themselves, they're not really going to translate into an improvement in your memory in your day-to-day life. So what I would suggest is have a look at the strategies that we had talked about, and I'll be happy to send a copy of my my PowerPoint to Cassidy, so she can distribute it to the participants if you would like, and check those out and see if any of those would work. And like I said, if they do not, then certainly the next step would be to have a neuropsychological assessment to have a look at exactly what's going wrong, and we can kind of help narrow down things that might be a little bit more helpful for you. But the games themselves are not going to be particularly beneficial.
Okay, thank you. Great question, Greg. Kelly had said very important presentation. Thank you. And I believe Nitin has a question. And then Chesney can go after him. I'm just trying to unmute you here. So let me unmute him.
So tell me.
Oh, there he is. Okay. Hi, you're unmuted. Did you have a question or comments?
Yeah.
No? Oh, okay. Okay, I thought I saw you raise your hand. Sorry. All right. Chesney?
Yes, hello. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. I'm so happy that I was here for it. So actually, I have an appointment with my neurologist. I'm from London, Ontario, and I just got into the specialist program. So my question is, so I just started back to school, and because it's online, it's a lot of eye strain, as you know, and I'm on the pharmaceutical topiramate. So
Okay. Yeah. All right.
it's a lot. So I wake up and it uh and I have to tell him this, but because it's so much on the computer, after I'm just wiped out, like I sleep probably until 5 or 6 p.m. and I have no idea, like after 12, because we start at 9 and it's 9 to 12 every day, and then I don't know, like the really big push right now is for me to get back driving so that I can get a job. And I don't know if that's because of school or because of because of the medication. But I mean, it's a pretty low dose. So, but also with the reading and everything else, you know, like the memory, like that's also, you said some pretty good things in your presentation. I just thought, like, where do you stand on all of that? Like, I made some good notes that I want to bring up, but because everything is virtual, I really have to be tactful in what I have to say because I don't get too much time. So
Right. So what was your question sort of relating to kind of how to handle the schoolwork? Like what would you like?
mm-hmm.
So I guess the first question that I would have for you is, so you mentioned that your topiramate is a relatively low dose. How long have you been on it?
Just since December, so about six months.
So it's been okay. So it's been a few months.
Or
So
not 6 months, but yeah. But
yeah, so it's definitely one of those medications that has a very significant impact on some people that take it. Actually, a lot of people that take it. Not everybody is affected equally, but I find that it's not necessarily dependent on dose so much as some people are just more reactive to it than others.
mm-hmm.
So it doesn't surprise me that you would have a significant problem with it. What are you taking in school? What's your what are you doing in university?
The social work program.
Okay, yeah, so it's very heavily on kind of verbal stuff and the all that sort of thing. Have you noticed any change in your performance since you've started topiramate?
When I first started taking it, it was fine. You know, I was going out for walks and but I just started just sleeping, like very sleepy. Like my diet is really good. So I mean, I don't know, like previous to taking that medication, I was so just full of life, and now I'm just like I have to take naps midday, and they last for, you know, maybe 3 hours or 4 hours. Like it's just very drowsy, like lethargic. Like I don't know how to even
that is
describe it.
before, and it's a very unfortunate side effect of all of this. You said that you have an appointment with your neurologist coming up.
Mm-hmm.
That would
Later
be something
today.
Okay, great. Well, that's good. It would be important to bring it up, right? Because maybe this is not
Mm-hmm.
the ideal medication for you. Because for a medication to be truly effective, it has to control your seizures, but it also has to not impair your quality of life, right? Because ultimately,
Mm-hmm.
what's the point of taking a medication that's having a horrible effect on your quality of life and your work and so forth? So I would suggest that you bring this up with your doctor and see if there's any alternative to that. Hopefully there is, in which case you can kind of switch over and do better on another medication. And as far as your thinking skills are concerned, I think pretty much literally anything is better than topiramate, right? I know that it can be very effective for some kinds of epilepsy, but when you're concerned about cognition and fatigue and things like that, it's really not the best. So it's a good topic to raise with your neurologist as quickly as possible today. In the meantime, in terms of your schooling, so you go from 9 to 12 with your lectures and such. Are the lectures live or are they recorded? How does that work?
They're live. And like most of our mark comes from that because we do like circles and it's more competency. And then we do have small, just competency based assignments that we do. But because they are shorter, the course is designed to test what we are retaining in that sense. So it's kind of like the instructor gets lost and we're like, I don't know, I find I get lost, and I brought it up with the dean the other day. So I said, you know, like I'm having a bit of a hard time just in the general context of where we are, you know, like, and then she just said, well, we should have a safety plan, who's in your house? And I said, no, there's no need for a safety plan.
It's not
Like,
a safety issue, it's just it's the cognitive issue. It's being able to focus and concentrate and actually be present in the lecture, sounds like.
yeah. And like, it's just knowing, because like my seizures are nocturnal. So I said, you know, like coming from a place where they don't know, right? It's just kind of like, how do I explain all of these terms?
That's a very good question. So I think thinking about sort of the memory and the academic issues that arise from that. What I'm hearing from your story is that it sounds like a lot of it is really a combination of both taking the medication that you're taking, plus the fact that everything is virtual and is online, and it's really not necessarily an ideal platform for you and or you know for a lot of people. So the best things to do at the moment would be to, first of all, like I said, talk to your neurologist about the possibility of changing over to a different medication or see what they say. And if you do not have any contacts in the accommodations or the disabilities office at your university or college, that would be the next place to go, because you definitely do need some accommodations until this thing gets sorted out with your medication. From what you're telling me, it's really a physiological problem that can be resolved if the medication is changed or if there's any kind of alteration in that regard. So until that gets sorted out, you would require academic accommodations to help you out. There's really not a lot that you can do given the demands of the program that you have.
Mm-hmm.
So definitely talk to your neurologist and talk to the accommodations people. Have you spoken to them before?
Yeah, I brought that up with the dean yesterday, so that was a big topic of our conversation.
People in the disabilities office?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, like I said, in situations where it's medication related, the answer is just to change the medication, right? So it sounds like it's really having a very negative impact on your quality of life in general. So this is a conversation you should have with your neurologist, because I have a feeling that if it's possible to change you over to something different, things will sort of improve on their own.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And your presentation is so informative. I just love attending these community events. Like, they're just so awesome.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for the questions.
I talked enough.
All right, there was another question, which is, sorry, excuse my dog. How do I get others to understand my memory? So like, I think they were talking about like peers, other family members that they don't see, that they don't live with. one of the questions that these are questions that people who couldn't make it to the Zoom.
Yeah. You know, it's a very broad question. I guess the most appropriate response that I can have is just be honest, right? The more you try to hide memory problems, the harder it's going to become to kind of navigate around, you know, your family, your friends, your community. And, you know, the fact of the matter is, if you have memory problems, you're not going to be able to fool people for long. Right? So people think about, well, I don't want to look like an idiot and I don't want people to think I'm stupid. And the best way to do that is just to be honest and upfront about the issues that you're having. Because if you try to hide the problems that you're having, that's going to make you look a lot worse than if you just come out and say, look, I have epilepsy, or I have, you know, this issue and it's causing some memory problems for me. So the best policy here is just kind of be honest and upfront about people that you're dealing with.
Okay. Another question was, so similar to Chesney's school question, is that I struggle with school and the homework load. How do I get my teachers and the school to understand my memory and that I am trying, even though with memory issues, it seems like I'm not to them?
So this comes back to kind of the issue of how do you manage your memory difficulties within a specific system, so employment or school. So, you know, in this case, you really need an intervention from either a local medical professional or the disabilities person at your school to be able to communicate these things to your teacher. I mean, obviously, you can always explain it to them and you can talk to them, and depending on the person that you're dealing with, they may or may not be receptive to that. What has happened in the past with my patients is that I have written letters to the school, to the teachers, to the disabilities office, outlining the difficulties that they're having and making recommendations on their behalf. And that usually does it, essentially. That's usually sufficient. So if that has not been done yet, that would be the first thing to do, just to make sure that you have documentation that you can take to the school and present it to them. And just make contact with the disabilities advisor at your school and have that conversation with them too. So that's kind of the best way to organize things on a systemic level.
Okay.
Excellent.
Awesome. See, I have hands raised. So another question that came through was, so this kind of reminds me of Greg's question comment about the app. So are there any sites or the activities that can help in terms of improving memories?
Not really. So all of the activities and websites that we have out there, they're not harmful. I mean, they're certainly good to do. It's good to keep your brain stimulated, but they're not really any better than doing any other stimulating activity that you enjoy, right? So the best thing is just to kind of keep your brain stimulated, do what you like, but these things are not going to improve your memory in your day-to-day life per se. Right? So it's not going to rehabilitate your memory. It's going to be helpful in terms of your general brain function, but there's nothing out there that can really improve your memory for day-to-day things aside from the strategies that we talked about. So none of the games or things that you kind of see on the internet are really going to be effective for that purpose.
Okay. Just check the comments. We should have there. Hands raised. Okay. So one of the questions I found interesting is the memory. So the memories kind of, you can't find them. I know it's like a library. So the memories that you can't seem to recall, are they gone forever? Why can they come back? And why do some memories come back and others don't?
Yeah. So are they gone forever? We don't know. So it's like, you know, again, in the messy library, like who knows what's in there. So our long-term memories are supposed to be permanent. But that certainly is not always the case. So is it the case that those memories are just gone, or is it the case that the pathway to those memories is gone? And there's no way to really know or learn that, right? There's just no answer to that. Why do some memories come back and others don't? Again, it depends on how they were coded and how they were stored. Some memories can come back with the right kind of cue or right kind of reminder because they're still there and they're still accessible. They just need kind of a different pathway to get to them. Whereas other memories are just either lost in the brain or are gone. So it's really hard to say which memories are going to come back and which ones aren't. It's almost impossible to predict that. And, you know, so it's much more likely that you're going to be able to bring the information back if you make sure that it's, organized. If you repeat it enough times, if you use all the strategies that we talked about, you're much more likely to be able to retrieve that information at a later date, even if it's difficult. But it doesn't guarantee anything, right? Because sometimes memories just kind of get lost because of other brain or neurological issues that you have. Or sometimes if you have a seizure around the time that you're forming new memories, those memories just don't get recorded, period. So they're just they don't even get into the library. So they're gone, right? Mm-hmm. And like I said, it's really difficult to say, whether they're gone forever, if they're still there but inaccessible, but it basically comes down to the same thing, right? So, but if you want to make sure that you have a greater chance of remembering new information, just make sure that you're paying attention, you're organized, that you're not distracted, and that you're using as many of the strategies as possible.
Okay, awesome. And so memories can be frustrating and play on the mental health. In terms of that, like the mental health portion of everything, what kind of like suggestions would you have for people going through that in terms of the memory and feeling down or frustrated that the memory is acting up?
Yeah. So, so are we talking about memories being affected by mental health or mental health affecting memory?
I think
they were saying like they get depressed, that they forget stuff. I remember how the conversation was going.
Yeah. So like they're trying to remember things and they can't. So then that kind of gets them a bit like depressed.
Right. It's basically not being able to remember. So we talked about kind of the stress and the mood affecting, being affected by poor memory. So, for that, it's, essentially, what I would recommend is a form of, cognitive behavioral counseling or therapy, right? Being able to normalize the experience of forgetting. So recognizing that forgetting is normal, right? It's not necessarily a pathological issue, that it's something that happens to everybody. So that's the first thing to to think about. The second thing is just making sure that you give yourself a chance to remember, just kind of being able to step back and think about what you're trying to remember to see if it comes to you. So not kind of getting down on yourself too much. And the third thing goes back to what we talked about in terms of being honest with people around you, because the more people are aware around you of what's going on, the less impactful it's going to be that you forget, because it's not a big deal anymore, right? So just normalizing the experience, giving yourself a lot of breaks and time to think about things and just sort of step back, and also being open and honest about the issues that you're having.
Okay. So I was talking to a friend of mine who he had started having seizures and didn't know, he knew about epilepsy from like what I've told him, but when he's kind of new to, like, he was really confused of why his memory was so bad. And I said like, oh, it's probably because of the seizures and that possible epilepsy, and he had no idea that memory was affected by epilepsy. Yeah. How would you recommend someone else, like someone explaining it to another who's, if you're not medical, and like what would you recommend as a good way to kind of like describe it to someone from the
non-medical?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, so describing it to somebody who's complaining about memory problems, or describing your own memory problems to somebody?
Kind of like, it's like the first one, like he was kind of couldn't figure out, like didn't know that epilepsy affected the memory. So I was trying like my best to explain it to him, but I don't know. If there's a better way than another.
The first thing to say is that memory problems in epilepsy are common. They're very, very common. It's probably the most common complaint that we hear. So just kind of letting them know that that's the case. And then talking about, some of the basic things that about epilepsy that make people more prone to having memory problems. So basically saying that when you have a seizure, which is an electrical, storm in the brain, essentially, it can interfere with how well your memories get from short-term to long-term storage, right? So that's number one. Your medication can impair how well you're able to store new memories and how well you're able to remember new memories. And also, depending on why you have epilepsy in the first place, the areas of the brain that control memory might be damaged, and that could impact how well kind of remembering those top three reasons why people with epilepsy would typically have memory problems. So the seizures themselves, the medication, and the brain damage underlying the epilepsy.
Okay.
And if they require any more detailed explanation, they definitely need to follow up with their doctor or their psychologist.
Awesome. Okay, so I
Any
think
other questions?
no more questions. So thank you everyone for joining in. All your questions, your comments, listening, taking it all in. Thank you, Dr. Omisade, for your time and your presentation, sharing your knowledge with us. It's very helpful in helping us understand why memory works the way it does with epilepsy and in general. There's a lot of great tips, definitely good ones to keep in mind for the future. I will be posting this online on by the end of the week, hopefully, if we don't lose power.
We have the power.
Yeah, that might get in way of editing, but other than that, it should be up at the end of the week. Dr. Omisade, do you have any last minute advice or comment you want to add on or share?
I just wanted to say, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and chat with all of you. I appreciate all your questions, and I'm always happy to answer more. And I'm very pleased to be able to come and do this. The things that I just want to, the last things I want to emphasize is just, remember that what you're experiencing is normal, right? It's for the most part, it's not going to get worse, right? And just be kind to yourself, because the kinder you are to yourself, the easier everything is, right? So just, think about that and remember that. And yeah, that's the most important part.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much again for joining in, and we'll talk to you soon. Yes. The awkward goodbyes as we find the end button.
Or Zoom goodbye.
Yeah.
Just making sure we got this.
I feel stronger than before. I'm not alone anymore. I look up and you are there. The stars are everywhere. Our lights are shining bright, filling up the night.